You are listening to 600 Second Saga. Today's feature is The Thing About the Future by Mariah Avix. The thing about the future is that the future is boring, ordinary. Just another Tuesday. I froze my brain 300 years ago. I was brilliant when I froze my brain. I made the decision when I started to notice my mental decline. I'd been monitoring my memory and general mental state for over a decade. When I noticed the downward trend on the graphs, I cut ties and went under. I knew it would be risky and I might never come out. 3 years ago, they revived me. They put me in a new body, a lab-grown copy of my body. I wasn't the first person they revived. There are several companies, dozens of people every day being put into new bodies. It took me months to relearn how to use mine, but it had taken years to get used to the new world. It was supposed to be easy. There was a stipend from the state, food, housing, everything was provided. Easy. Life was easy. Figuring out who I was in the future felt insurmountable. Tell us about your biggest change. I sat on the couch in my small apartment facing an audience of several hundred psychology students. Well, everyone is shorter. The audience laughed obligingly. I had been tall, over 6 feet, but the general population was now just under 5 feet tall. It was the simplest answer, the one that always got a chuckle. The professor who was interviewing me smiled politely, waiting for me to continue. Everything is so easy now, it's not like we fight to live every day. You mean resources including stipends and safety nets? I nodded. In my first try at life, people often died because they didn't have enough to eat, or a home to keep them warm, or even basic health care. Audience members gasped and whispered. I didn't have that problem, of course, but it was just background in the world. There was murmuring. I saw students flicking out and then back in across the audience. What did you do to help them? I hated this. I could cut the conversation. All I had to do was leave. And yet this was the highlight of my month. College students thinking of me as a monster. Nothing. Almost no one did. I sat up straighter. And I know this is shocking for some of you. But it is important to remember that you only think that because you were raised in this world. You are not special or different from your peers. Raised in a different world, you'd like to believe you would have been a different person, someone special. But here you are, with hundreds of other people doing the same thing as your peers. Thinking the same way as your peers. It is your peers that matter. Your peers then would have been people who thought nothing of walking past a starving homeless man on the street. I said I would never fall behind with technology, or music, or pop culture. I bought all the new tech as soon as it came out. I was going to keep up. I couldn't even hear all the notes in modern music. They'd altered my eyes slightly so I could see the edges of colors that I hadn't been able to see hundreds of years before, but it was just a little. Everything sounded dissonant to me. Food tasted off. Art looked wrong. The world had left me so far behind, I couldn't even make sense of it anymore. I smiled as I strolled past an exhibit. Reaching out, my fingers brushed over the familiar smartphones. "Hey, do you understand how these work?" I turned and saw a young man behind me, holding a large iPhone in his small hands like a tablet, poking at the screen and toggling the buttons. I touched the virtual phone in front of me and curled my hand around it. I grinned and held it up, powering it on. Touch screen, but you have to turn it on first. The man looked baffled. Nothing was ever turned off. Shift to a low power mode, maybe. But there was always a charge coursing through the air, so power switches were obsolete. I showed him the power, the touch screen, the generations of smartphones and tablets. I grinned at my classroom full of students. A few more blinked into existence. I looked down at the podium in front of me. Very old-fashioned for them, of course. But it worked well with the theme of the class. I tapped a button, and my carefully curated row of devices appeared in the front of the room. A pager, a flip phone, phones with keyboards, and perfectly smooth devices with only one single button. Can you imagine, for a moment, having only the information stored in your brain, not being able to access anything you couldn't remember yourself, not being able to talk to others instantly, not being connected? I sucked in a breath and grinned. I was still a great teacher. For those of you brave enough, I want to ask you to totally disconnect for 5 minutes. I heard gasps. It was unlikely that these kids could even remember not being connected, that any of them had ever been. I might as well have asked them to cut off an arm. But students blanked out. I waited until every student in front of me snapped out of existence for 5 minutes. As they came back to the classroom, I sipped a hot tea and listened to them fumble for words, talking excitedly to me and each other. That was most of human history. This course is going to cover the incredible human feat of making that transition. Most of you know that I actually lived through this period, so I have experienced many of the steps we will talk about. My students whispered to each other. They started asking questions. I was the expert again. The future started to feel more like home. I belong in the future. This was The Thing About the Future by Mariah Avix. More work can be found at 600 Second Saga. Check our show notes for links. Music is provided by Mads. Learn more about 600 Second Saga, our authors, how to submit your flash fiction, and how to support the podcast in the show notes. This has been Mariah Avix and 600 Second Saga.